Welcome to another episode of The Cynical Writer. Before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone that if you would like to support this channel, the best way to do that is to purchase my books, and I've left a link in the description section in case you're interested. And my latest book is called The Ecstasy and the Ignominy. It is essentially a literary historical novel. It's somewhat of a combination between Anna Karenina, A Tale of Two Cities, and also a little bit of Crime and Punishment. And the language at times can sound almost Shakespearean, with also some Dickensian elements as well. And so, why do writers go bad? And what I mean by that is, why are there so many examples of writers who behave badly or are immoral, um, and so forth. And well, to me, I don't think it's because writers are somehow more, let's say, susceptible to sin than the average population. I don't think it's that. Um, I think it's just that when it comes to famous people, whether they are writers or otherwise, that famous people are obviously put under a microscope where their sins are very obvious to us because they're in the public eye. But there are people, non-famous people, doing the same kinds of things they are. They're just not in the public eye. Um, and I also think that when someone is rich and famous and powerful and influential, they have more opportunities um, to, let's say, engage in immoral behavior when compared to the average person. If you have, let's say, a man who might want to commit adultery, but he's not rich, he's not particularly attractive. He may want to, but he doesn't have any opportunities to do that. Whereas a rich and famous person has more opportunities to sin, so to speak. If everyone is fawning over you and they're all like trying to get something from you, and if they're afraid to tell you what they think, if they are sycophants, if they kiss up to you, well then a person like that is going to have far more opportunities to engage in things like adultery and various other vices, or utilize their power to control people. It's just that if someone already has an immoral character, being rich and being famous can amplify that. But it's not. So I do think that rich and famous people have more opportunities to engage in certain kinds of vices when compared to the average person. That doesn't mean that the average person doesn't have those vices. It doesn't mean their heart isn't conditioned that way. Because, for example, in the Bible, Jesus talks about lusting in the heart. Now, some people think that means that you are lusting, that lust means you simply have a sexual thought, or you have sexual desires. But to me, that's not what entirely what lust means. To me, lust means you are coveting that. If if under the right circumstances you could be with someone, then you would be with them if you had that opportunity. It's that plus the sexual thoughts together. It's not purely imagination. It's the desire to go in that direction. You can have a lust for money and many other kinds of things. And but to me, though, there are many people though who would commit adultery if they had the opportunity. They just don't have that opportunity. Whereas rich and famous people definitely do. And of course, we have some examples like alleged examples, and I'm going to say that all of this is alleged because it hasn't been proven definitively yet. But you have people like Neil Gaiman, who has been accused of in impropriety and taking advantage of people, and sexual misconduct and so forth, and abuse. And then you have, I mean, that's a modern example. Um, if you were to go back to some some people in the past, um, you could you Charles Dickens could be an example. Um, Dickens is someone who, when I found out that he had engaged in such thing, well, I'll tell you that in Dickens' situation, what essentially happened is that he was a good and kind family man in the early part of his life. And by all indications, he really and sincerely loved his wife. Um, but it was in his later years that he started to become dissatisfied um, with his wife, and he started, and there are many reasons for that. I think one reason is that she started, obviously because of all of their children, she started to put on weight, and he became dissatisfied with that. Um, he became dissatisfied with the fact that she did not apparently understand him intellectually. Although it seems to me that that's something, if he wanted that, that's something he should have worked out that he wanted in a wife early on. Um, but um, but anyway, and of course, it's quite possible that she was intellectual and he just didn't see it. It's difficult to know. Um, but anyway, because she did accompany on his trips and did act at times somewhat of a secretary for him. But he became dissatisfied over time. But I think one of the reasons is that the the fame went to his head. Is that a lot of people don't understand when it comes to someone like Charles Dickens, is that he was more famous in terms of like popularity, in terms of like people who were fans of his in his lifetime, than really any writer before or since. I mean, no one really else compares. Like if you look at someone like Shakespeare, he was considered a great writer in his day, but the idea of a writing celebrity really hadn't caught on yet. Um, but so when some people like to talk about, oh, no one celebrated when no one mourned when Shakespeare died, well, again, the whole idea of a writer being a celebrity really hadn't caught on yet, like it has now. But Dickens was enormously famous. He was treated like a rock star before rock stars existed. He would travel the world. He would go to America. He'd travel Europe. He giving readings, and I think the fame ultimately went to his head because. And when I found out that Charles Dickens had engaged in such vices, it was hugely devastating to me because Dickens portrayed himself not just as a writer, but as a moral authority on quite a lot of matters, especially when it came to poverty and treating the poor correctly, and women's rights and liberation and all of that. But the trouble was, though, is that he was a huge hypocrite, especially when it came to women's rights, because he did not apply those same principles in his own personal life. In his own personal life, he was more like Scrooge later on, and I think that's because he became so rich and famous that I think he started to believe that he was more morally important, that he was more important, that he was superior to everyone else, and therefore he didn't have to play by the same rules. He didn't have to adhere to the same ethics. That he was better than everyone else. I honestly believe the fame went to his head, and fame can do that to writers, and also not anyone who becomes famous can become susceptible if they already have those dark desires in their hearts. Well, what ultimately happened with Dickens, though, is that he ultimately started having an affair. Some scholars think he did it, but most scholars he didn't. But most scholars think he did. But with this young actress named Ellen Ternan, and he essentially left his wife and essentially put her away, and most of his children went with him, and he even prevented most of his children from seeing her. I mean, it was incredibly cruel. And then there's some indication that, for example, that he tried to get her thrown into a mental institution. So he advocated for women's rights, but he was a huge hypocrite in that regard when it came to his own personal life. There are so many people, and I think Dickens may have been one of them, who advocate for moral progress, so to speak, in order to seem like a good, righteous, upstanding person, but they don't actually apply those principles when they're inconvenient, which makes you kind of doubt whether they actually believed in them in the first place, or whether they were just a front in order to gain power. Um, I think with Dickens, it remains to be seen because he was quite heartfelt, in his writings. But at the same time, he was a huge hypocrite in that regard. And at the very least, there was a cognitive dissonance. Something was rotten in his soul. And looking back, if I had been, um, if I could go back in time, it's quite possible that I would try to expose Dickens, and he probably wouldn't like me. But even though I am a huge fan of his, because I do think that he never really received the comeuppance that he deserved yeah, in his life, and he needed to be kicked in the teeth in order to knock some sense into him. Um, because by every indication, he didn't really even feel bad about what he did at the end of his life. And again, I'm a huge fan of Dickens, and I was highly disillusioned when I found out that Dickens was essentially was such a monster in his own personal life. Was so entitled and egocentric and narcissistic, um, and almost Machiavellian at times. And But I think ultimately the fame went to his head, and apparently he did not have the staunch moral character in order to prevent from being corrupted, because there are some writers that do have that have led decent moral lives from history. You have someone like J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien's very clean. I mean, I can't really find a lot of bad things about him. The same thing with C.S. Lewis. Yes, he did have some trouble at the end of his life when he was tried to marry a woman who had already been married, even though her husband had apparently committed adultery and she had been an atheist at the time and now she was a believer. There's no reason why he should have had any trouble. He was perfectly justified in that marriage. Um, and in many ways, in many ways it was rather sweet and heartfelt. Um, so there are writers who can resist that temptation. But if you already have something that it has gone wrong in your character, um, fame and success can amplify that. And I do think, though, that one reason why artists are particularly susceptible to certain vices and temptations, though, is because, and I talked about this in another video actually, but um, writers and artists can be tempted to essentially try to create their own values, to try to be their own god, so to speak, to say, well, I don't need moral values or limits. I can create my own values through my art. But that is hubris. True art is glorifying the transcendent. It's not glorifying yourself. And so I think that artists are in particular susceptible to that kind of temptation, which is why I think some of them end up going bad, so to speak. Um, but I don't think that artists are in particularly any more evil or susceptible than other human beings. It's just that famous artists can have more opportunities. And again, but even non-famous artists can be susceptible to that temptation to try to be relativistic and to create their own values. I've even felt that temptation, at times, but I have resisted it. And it can be a tight walk to line. I mean, a tight a tight line to walk, because, like for example, like there are many writers now who get in trouble for sexual harassment and other kinds of things, even in cases where they may have been they their flirtations may have been entirely innocent. Like, I know, for, like, with me, for example, like if I were married, then I would not even attempt to develop, at least purposefully, really close friendships with other women. Of course, I would be kind, I would be cordial, I would be polite. Um, but I would also try to have some propriety. Because I'm a single man, then obviously I'm going to flirt some, because I'm thinking, is the next woman Miss Right? Is she the one? In many ways, writers and artists who are married have an advantage because they don't have to think that about every woman that they meet. Um, with me, if I had a wife, then I would try to just and I would try to choose wisely who I marry. Um, but if I chose the right person, then I would try devote all of my passion towards her, and I would just try to ignore the rest. Of course, men, are programmed to be interested in multiple different kinds of women, so it's always a temptation. But I think that I could pour all of my passion in one area if I actually had an area where I could pour that passion. But right now, it's just I'm scattered because I don't have that kind of person in my life, and therefore I can be somewhat scattered in terms of my passions. Um, but to me, I always try to view such things through a lens of morality, that there are lines that I will not cross, and that ultimately will have to answer to God for all of my actions. But when writers are relativistic in their thinking and they don't have that in their life, um, then they can be more susceptible to Machiavellian temptations, which is why I think that in some cases so many authors go bad, so to speak. Um, and I'll tell you another story, is that like for example, I no longer put my faith in writers because I'm not surprised by anything that they might do. Um, like for example, I used to look up to this one man named he wasn't a writer. I mean, he was a writer technically, not a fiction writer. I mean, he was more of a philosopher named Ravi Zacharias. He was a philosopher, a Christian apologist, and I used to say he inspired me. He was almost a hero of mine, and he I used to say at one time that that he spoke more like Christ than almost anyone that I had ever heard. And so when I found out after his death that he had engaged in impropriety with masseuses, that he had essentially started massage businesses so he could take advantage of them and harass them, I was absolutely shocked because he had shown no sign really that he was that that he had that dark side of him. I was completely taken by surprise. Normally, I'm pretty good at spotting fools, but in that case, I was completely fooled. But he did teach me a good lesson, however, which is not to put your faith even subconsciously in men. Only put your faith in Christ and in God. And so, but he taught me a lesson that if he could fall, then anyone could fall, which is why I'm not surprised when writers, or especially someone like Neil Gaiman, who already had certain suspicions about him, um, or a sleazy side to him. I'm not surprised when people like that engage in it, because men of far greater, let's say, moral stature, at least outwardly, have have committed far worse sins. So it's no surprise to me when they do it. Um, and also, but I don't think that this should put off people from exploring from exploring art by artists, because I do think it is important to separate the art from the artist, because if you only consume the art of people who are morally perfect, then you might as well just not read anything, because that's impossible. Especially if you're holding them to the standard of always agreeing with them, um, because people are going to have different opinions, and sometimes you need to read opinions that challenge you, even if you disagree with them, even if you're very sure they're right, in order to be a more educated, more enlightened human being. Um, you have to challenge yourself when it comes to these things, and recognize that artists are all flawed human beings. And so it is important to separate the art from the artist, because of course it is getting far more difficult to separate the art from the artist in this social media age, when you have so many writers who are um, who are basically presenting themselves on social media, and people fall more in love with the writer than with their work. um, but to me, and I know it can be difficult sometimes, like for example, I find it more difficult to separate the art from the artist when it comes to actors, because you can actually see their face. And so if there's an actor has done something that I don't like, it can be more difficult to separate it um, than with with writers where you don't see their faces. But ultimately, I think it has to be personal discretion. Like, you might not be comfortable reading someone, but that doesn't mean you should say that someone else can't read that person. But ultimately, I think that art is about exploring the flaws within humanity, including the artist. And so you have to be you don't have to condone their behavior, but you have to be open-minded when it comes to exploring art, because that's the only way you will learn and grow as a person. Otherwise, you will be stagnant as a person. We learn through art by exploring the human condition, including the condition of the artist, which may not always be what we want it to be, um, but it will be honest. Um, Even if the artist himself is not honest in terms of his behavior, quite often his artist will be more honest than he is. Um, we can often find, let's say, or detect that a writer or artist has certain vices just by looking at his text, even if he himself would deny it. And so, art is about exploring the fragmented and tainted nature of the soul. Um, you should not expect moral perfection in art. You can't even find it. You can't even find that in religion, let alone art. And so it's important to not be. It's important to keep an open mind and to not be a Puritan in such matters. But at the same time, you can also um, condemn artists for their actions as well. Um, you can condemn them, but also enjoy their art at the same time. Um, it's that nuance in art that I think that makes it so interesting. And so I hope you enjoyed this video. It's been quite a long one, my longest video yet, I believe. And but this is a complex topic, and I would certainly like to know what you think about it. But I hope you enjoyed it, and my books are linked in the description section. And until next time, goodbye.